One of the great pleasures of reading a book by Foster Hirsch is that you come across movies you have never heard of before, and it sends you to Amazon Prime. I remember in your book on Otto Preminger, I think it was a wonderful movie with Nicole Williamson, The Human Stain. That was The Human Factor, a very elegant, interesting movie that I'd never watched before. So the movie that I found in Foster's book is a wonderful movie with Joseph Cotten and Teresa Wright called The Steel Trap, which is a terrific film noir movie. And as I was watching the movie, it got me thinking about your book. Because
wait, I have to say, right now, I chose the right person to interview me, because The Steel Trap is my secret discovery. That's almost my favorite film of the 1950s, and we have not discussed it.
At all, not at all.
This is the real thing.
I watched it this afternoon. I swear to God, I watched this, and it was riveting.
Fabulous, right?
Riveting.
It's a fabulous film.
Absolutely. Joseph Cotten.
Nobody knows it.
Nobody knows it. But you can get it on Amazon Prime, and I encourage you.
Oh, good.
Joseph Cotten and Teresa Wright. And it got me thinking about your book, Foster, because it's about a man who is Mr. Conformity of the 1950s. He's a bank assistant manager. He's got a lovely little house in the suburbs. He's got a beautiful wife. He's got a lovely daughter. And yet he decides to steal $1 million from the bank. And the tension ratchets up because he comes up with a perfect plot, but everything begins to go wrong. And it's gripping. But what Foster is getting at in the book, and I think this movie gets at, and film noir gets at, is that there's this misperception we have of the 1950s, of being conformist and bland and the dull Eisenhower years, when in fact so much was roiling, politically, economically, socially, and of course in the entertainment business. So I would begin our discussion, Foster, with what is going on that makes film noir so important in the 1950s?
I think just what you said, and you actually hit on my main motive for writing the book, in addition to recording my experience as a young moviegoer, was to sort of defend the 1950s, my decade, from this accusation, as you say, of blandness and conformity and dullness and stuffiness, all of which was true. But beneath that, something very provocative and anxious making was going on.
Yeah.
And a film like Steel Trap captures what's beneath the conformity.
Right.
And there's something beneath it, because after all, the 50s led to the 60s.
That's right.
The 60s didn't come from nowhere. The 60s grew out of the 50s, which is not the age of blandness that it's unfairly accused of being.
That's right. Yeah.
It's a much more complicated period. The blacklist, the deep political tensions, the racial conflicts. There were so many conflicts.
And the threat of nuclear war hanging over our heads every single day. Right.
Absolutely.
Now, in the entertainment business, a lot is roiling and changing, because as you begin the book, we are coming to the end of the studio system, the end of the great moguls who are beginning to lose their grip on power. And you have a wonderful chapter on Louis B. Mayer. And if you could just tell us how he lost his empire.
Well, it happened at the beginning of the 50s. Louis B. Mayer lost his place at MGM in May 1951, the most powerful man in Hollywood and the highest paid employee in the United States, and he was fired. If it could happen to Louis B. Mayer, it could happen to anyone.
And why did they fire him?
Under his watch for the last few years, Metro lost millions of dollars. He didn't have his finger on the popular taste anymore. After the war, tastes changed. And Louis B. Mayer was great for the 30s and the 40s, but post-war, his grasp of what the popular touch was slipped. They got rid of him. And they replaced him with somebody who was his opposite in every way, Doris Sherry. Louis B. Mayer had this wonderful, idealized view of America.
Right.
And Doris Sherry wanted to make black and white social dramas.
Right.
Louis B. Mayer said about Doris Sherry's movies, like The Asphalt Jungle, I wouldn't walk across the street to see a film like that.
Excuse me, I'm sorry to interrupt. Could you speak up a little bit, Foster? We're having difficulty.
Can you hear us on the mic?
Well, I don't think your mic is working.
That's recorded. Michael, yours
That's
is good.
recorded.
You're good.
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, okay.
It's my,
That's a recorder.
Oh, that's the recorder.
that's a recorder.
Oh.
Is that the mic there?
That's also a recorder.
That's a recorder.
So there's my mic.
Oh, well,
No mic.
we'll have to project.
We have to project.
That's right.
We have to project.
Right. We're not silent film stars.
Right.
But not only Louis B. Mayer loses his touch, but the heads of the other studios all begin to fall by the wayside as well. Is it that they all just could not understand how the world had changed after World War II, that people were looking for a different kind of movie and these guys couldn't grasp it?
The heads of the studios were conservative. At that time, politically conservative and artistically conservative. They didn't want to change their stripes. They felt what worked for them in the 20s, 30s, and 40s should work for them in the 50s. They were very resistant to change.
Right.
They introduced CinemaScope and 3D with great reluctance. They did as a method of survival, but they didn't want to.
Right.
They wanted to do the same thing over and over again.
Right.
They didn't want to change. The only mogul who was really successful in the 50s was Daryl Zanuck, who
Right.
saved the industry with the introduction of CinemaScope. And after he saved the industry, he left because he was having a midlife crisis and he went off to Europe to be with his mistress.
Right. And he gambled and drank
And he gambled and he drank.
in the Riviera.
And he was.
My hero.
He was the most successful of all the old-time moguls, and he walked away from it. The others, Harry Cohn died.
Yep.
The others died, were deposed. Jack Warner stayed on.
He did, yeah.
He
Yeah.
stayed on longer than anybody else.
Right.
He had the longest run.
Right. But now you make the case, and it's a fascinating chapter, that the worst mogul of all, who ran a studio into the ground, was Howard Hughes.
Hands down, the worst.
Tell us about Howard Hughes.
Hands down, the worst. Well, he was so quixotic. A film would be ready to go, and he would pull it and edit it, and then re-edit it, for no reason at all. But even under his mismanagement, good films got released at RKO.
Such as?
All the film noir that got
Yeah.
released there.
Yeah. Yeah.
One after the other, Sudden Fear, my next favorite film,
Yes.
noir after Steel Trap, is an RKO film. Where Danger Lives is an RKO film on dangerous ground. RKO had a track record with film noir.
Yeah.
And he didn't stop the good ones. He had good directors working for him. But he wasn't a mogul. He was distracted by his own business. He wouldn't ever go to the RKO lot. He worked out of an office at Samuel Goldwyn Studios. He never went to RKO, but he tried to run it. Here's an example of his craziness. There was a very good musical, believe it or not, produced by Howard Hughes. Douglas, what's the name of it? Oh, my goodness.
Broadway musical?
Yes, about television.
A Broadway musical about television.
1951, A Ticket to Broadway. with
Ticket to Broadway.
With Janet Leigh. Anyway, it's actually a good musical with a score by Julie Stein.
Yeah.
Howard Hughes said, tear down the sets, bring them to Samuel Goldwyn, rebuild them so I can see them. Tear them down, after he saw them, he said, tear them down at Samuel Goldwyn and then ship them back to RKO. Is that crazy?
Into the ground it went.
But the film was actually pretty good.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a good old-fashioned original movie musical.
Absolutely. So you also have going on now, and you get into this in the book, you have the beginning and then the apex of McCarthyism in the 1950s. And you have Hollywood running scared because so many of the people in Hollywood had been members of the Communist Party in the 1930s.
Would you say so many?
Quite a few, I think.
You would say quite a few?
Yeah, I think quite a few were. I mean, they were young people, and it was a different world then. You know, it was before they knew the crimes of Stalin and all that, and they were idealistic.
They were idealistic.
Right. How come McCarthyism goes after Hollywood?
McCarthy had no role in the Hollywood blacklists. None. He was only pointing fingers at Washington. McCarthy was not involved in Hollywood at all.
So who was? Who did this?
The HUAC, the Committee on American Activities. They went to Hollywood questioning communists. The first round was in 47, the second round was in 51, and after the 47 round, there was the Waldorf statement, which was the blacklist.
Right.
The moguls caved in. They caved into pressure from Washington, to pressure from Wall Street, to pressure from their constituents. They were very afraid of losing more money and they were afraid that Washington would start telling them how to run their business. And also, they were afraid of anti-Semitism.
Oh.
Hollywood was founded by Jews.
Yeah.
You wouldn't know that by the Museum of the Academy of Motion Picture.
Right.
They have an exhibit on Spike Lee, and you forget for the Jewish founders.
Well, yes, well, yeah, well, that's a whole nother issue that unfortunately we are dealing with.
It's a relevant issue to
It
this
is,
story.
absolutely.
Because the men who founded the industry were assimilated Jews.
Yep.
They had spent their lives, they were born in Eastern Europe, most of them. They'd spent their lives becoming Americanized.
Right.
They were secular Jews. They were not religious Jews. They wanted to avoid making movies about Jewish subjects.
Yeah.
And absolutely forbidden was any movie on the Holocaust. It was a sacred subject. It was too raw. It was too emotional. So they downplayed their Jewish identity. The morning that the Waldorf statement was signed, a Republican congressman named John Rankin had an openly anti-Semitic diatribe on the floor of Congress, saying many of the people who signed statements had changed their names. Danny Kaye was Daniel Kaminsky, and it went on from there. There was an open, naked anti-Semitism. Sound familiar?
Yes, exactly.
And
Can't tell.
They were scared.
They were scared of that.
They were scared. And they thought if they cooperated with the committee and agreed to blacklist communist or former communist employees who hadn't come clean, they could save their studios, their lives, their reputations. They ran scared. We can sit back now and say they were cowardly.
Yeah.
We can scorn what they did, this un-American, to impose a blacklist. But there were compelling reasons why they did. Compelling reasons.
One of the great directors, who's a character in your book, somebody who I got to know toward the end of his life, fascinating man, but he famously named names, and that's Elia Kazan. When you think about Kazan's life, why do you think he made that decision to turn his friends in?
His is a very complicated story. Kazan joined the party in the 30s for idealistic reasons.
As many people
As many did.
Yeah.
You said it
Yeah.
correctly.
Yeah.
As many did. He joined because he thought communism represented an alternative to an economic system which at the time in this country had failed.
Right.
But as he got indoctrinated into the party, he saw how much of a mind control situation it was, how it indoctrinated people, how little freedom of thought it
Allowed.
allowed,
Yeah.
and it demanded strict conformity to an ideology. And he disliked the idea that the communists propagated that art is a weapon, that you use your art to advance party policy. He used his art to tell stories of universal humanity.
Yeah.
He wasn't interested in telling a political point of view.
Yeah.
He did not want to name names. He did not. But thinking it over, he felt that communism really did represent a threat to this country, and that he felt an obligation to name names. Now, the most horrible part of the entire blacklist period was when the committee asked witnesses to name names, when the committee already had
The names.
all the names.
Oh, no.
I have it in my book.
Yep.
It's absolutely documented. They had all the names of people who had gone to meetings, who were sympathetic to communism, you know, the so-called fellow travelers. They had all the names. Asking witnesses to name names was a ritual of degradation and humiliation. The villains of the entire blacklist period were not the moguls, but the committee, the House on Un-American Activities Committee.
Led by one Richard Nixon, I do
He
believe.
was instrumental
Yeah.
in the early days.
Yep.
There were worse,
Yeah.
but he was certainly on that side.
Right.
They had the names.
Right. Right. All right, to lighten up a little bit, 1950s.
Well, you see, the 1950s is more.
Absolutely. I mean, Foster's book is so rich with these stories and the stuff that's going on not only in Hollywood, but in the country at the time. But, all right, 3D. Who invented it? How did it come about? And why did it not last?
I love 3D. And I don't know if any of you know, there's been a series connected with my book down at the Film Forum, 50 from the 50s.
Oh, yeah.
And all the 3D films have continually sold out.
Do they give you the paper glasses with the...
No, they're better. They're better than that. It was perceived at the time that 3D was a gimmick,
Yeah.
that it was made to tell cheap second feature kind of stories, that Hollywood was not using its best talent to tell 3D, and that as a result, it got stamped as an inferior, passing, incidental medium. When it's used creatively, Hitchcock used it
Yep.
in Dial M for Murder.
Yep. Yep.
Douglas Sirk used it in Taza, Son of Cochise, a great director. So when great directors use 3D, and even the not-so-great ones, 3D could be a wonderfully visual, potent medium. I love it. It didn't last because people didn't like wearing glasses.
Didn't Dory Sherry hate it?
Dory Sherry hated 3D.
The glasses gave him a headache.
It gave him a headache. He hated 3D. He didn't like any of the new technologies. But 3D was I regret that it didn't last longer. The first film was Born a Devil in 52.
Right.
It was basically over by 54. 3D keeps getting reinvented. You can see a 3D movie now.
IMAX it's called now, right?
IMAX 3D.
Yeah.
But even now, it's sort of phasing out.
Why do you think that is?
There's a surcharge.
Right.
Some people don't like it. They don't think it adds anything important to the movie-going experience. I don't feel that way. I feel it adds something essential. It enhances the image.
My wife and I, we watched Dial M for Murder the other night, which I do love the play, but it's a bit flat as a movie. But I have seen it in 3D, and it works better in 3D.
If you saw it at home flat, you didn't see the movie.
Yeah.
Dial M for Murder has to be seen in 3D. It's terrific.
Right.
Hitchcock uses 3D so powerfully that every lamp on every table becomes a character in the drama.
That's right.
It has an illumination and a personality.
Absolutely. And it's flat without it. It's a flat movie without it.
It's flat without it. It's
Yeah.
not very good without it.
I
It's a perfect case for 3D.
I would make the case for 3D. I remember takes me back. I was reading your book, and this memory came back from childhood. My father was a member of a Kiwanis Club in Geneseo, New York, and this would have been in the 1970s. And they were showing, for whatever reason, and he took me to see it, The Creature from the Black Lagoon in 3D. And I must have been 7 years old. To this day, Foster, I remember the beautiful woman swimming in the lagoon and the creature's fin hand reaching out in 3D to try to stroke her leg, and it's almost stroking you in the audience. That's how thrilling 3D could be.
And that's the most popular 3D title. It's sold out at every performance at Film Forum, and I'm actually going to Portland, Oregon in February to do a program, and the fellow there is very nice. He said, well, we feel you should only do one film, not a whole series, and if you do one film, you'll have a bigger audience. And I said, well, Dan, what film would that be? And guess the film that he chose.
Creature
he
from...
said, we're a large theater. If we book Creature in 3D, you'll sell out and sell tons of books. So I'm going to Portland. I've never been there to talk about Creature from the Black Lagoon.
Fabulous.
You chose right. Isn't that a memorable scene?
Oh, when he's trying to touch her leg there, and the hand is touching your face, practically sitting in the... It's wonderful. Now, another genre that really emerges and becomes very popular in the 50s, the Westerns. Why do you think the Westerns grabbed the American imagination in the 1950s?
Well, many of the best of them were political allegories.
Yeah.
People didn't quite know that at the time.
Yeah.
High Noon is a political
Totally.
allegory
Yep.
about the blacklist mentality
Yep.
in Hollywood.
Yep. Yep.
310 to Yuma is a political allegory. And something else interesting. The 50s said to be such a conservative, politically conservative period. In the 50s, there was the beginning of the revisionist Western, which meant a more thoughtful or reasoned assessment of the reactionary Westerns,
Yeah.
which automatically treated indigenous population as the racial other.
Yeah. They scalp you and they
scalp
charge
you,
the fort.
They come after you,
yeah.
they kill you,
Yeah.
and that's all. We don't know them, we don't want to know them, they're just the enemy.
All right.
And there began to be a feeling that that was not a proper way to deal with fellow Americans. And in the 50s, in films like Broken Arrow and The Devil's Canyon and Broken Lance, there was and The Searchers.
Oh, that's a
the most
brilliant.
pained,
Yeah.
and a pained and thoughtful analysis of racism
Yeah.
through the depiction of the John Wayne character. There's an attempt-
Who is brilliant as an actor in that movie. You can see his struggles to accept, to understand, his confronting his own racism. You can see it in his eyes in that movie.
If John Wayne did no other part but that, you'd say he was a good film actor.
Yeah.
That's his best performance. And it's exactly about what you're saying. It's about that character's struggle to come to terms with his racism.
Yeah.
Parenthetically, John Wayne did something very kind to a Native American actress in the film. On the set one day, she was in tears, and he asked her why. She said, filming my scenes, Mr. Wayne, I'm going to miss my son's wedding.
Oh.
And he said, I'm going to close down the shooting for a few days to allow you to go to your son's wedding. Makes you think a little more about John Wayne.
It does.
You
It does.
haven't perhaps thought before.
Right.
But that remark and that character was reflective of the attempt in American Westerns of the 50s to come to grips with the reactionary
Yeah.
conventions of earlier periods.
You mentioned High Noon, and a dear friend of mine is Jonathan Foreman, writer and film critic, and his father was Carl Foreman.
I just interviewed Amanda at the Film Forum.
Oh, yeah, I know Amanda
Yeah.
very well. Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, his daughter, Carl's
His daughter.
Yeah, yeah.
And I said to Amanda, you are a living witness of the blacklist because she's an American.
Yeah.
But she speaks with an English accent.
She does, yes.
Because her father was blacklisted.
And he had, well, he was blacklisted and he had to leave and make movies in London because he was blacklisted. But what you said about John Wayne, that sensitivity, and we think of John Wayne as, you know, he was a Republican and a Reagan supporter, but people are not always what they seem. Gary Cooper, who was conservative, Gary Cooper, who did High Noon, always stood up for Carl Foreman, who was a communist.
Who had been
a communist, yes.
Had been communist. Amanda spoke about this the other night. She said her father had been a communist.
Yeah.
Found out what was going on under the name of communism and rejected it. But he would not name names.
He would not.
Kazan could and did. Foreman could not. Couldn't do it.
Yeah. And he was exiled in London for a long, long time. But Gary Cooper, who was a conservative, stood up for Carl Foreman, and they were very close friends.
Stanley Kramer, the producer of High Noon, wanted to fire Carl Foreman because he thought Carl Foreman's association with communism would taint him.
Mm-hmm.
You could understand Kramer's position.
Yep.
And Gary Cooper said, if Foreman leaves the film, Cooper leaves the film.
Yeah. You have a great chapter on the big actresses of the 40s who are struggling through the 50s. Bette Davis jumps to mind, of course. How do these women navigate the change in the studio system when they were basically told, this is the part you're going to play, we're going to make you a huge star, and now the studio system is falling apart? How does someone like Bette Davis navigate her career in the 1950s?
She didn't have very good success. She didn't realize it at the time, but she was better off under Warner Brothers than she was after she left Warner Brothers. She had one great role in the 50s, her greatest role, All About Eve.
Right.
But nothing else.
Nothing else.
Nothing else.
But she does come around, though, with Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, with another actress who navigated the 50s a little better.
Joan Crawford. Did better in the 50s than Bette Davis did.
Do you have an insight into why Joan Crawford did better?
She was easier to get along with, believe it or not.
Yeah, well, that often works in showbiz.
Somebody who worked with Joan Crawford told me, if she didn't want to be difficult, she wasn't. Whereas Bette Davis couldn't help herself. I think that had something to do with it.
Right.
And Joan Crawford, but Bette Davis too, Joan Crawford reluctantly, but did accept the fact that she would have to take older roles.
Right.
She would have to age on screen if she wanted her career.
Sudden terror.
Continue. Sudden fear.
Sudden fear, yeah.
Her husband wants to kill her.
Right.
Sudden fear. You're a glamour queen, you play a part, and your greatest role, actually, a part in which your husband wants to kill you, and the next year she plays a part in which the man who's in love with her is blind.
Well,
that's called accommodating to the time.
Absolutely, completely. But Sudden Fear is another great movie that you love in the
Fabulous.
book. And it's interesting because she's a successful playwright, she's an older woman, and Jack Palance is the younger man that she falls in love with, but she realizes that he wants to kill her for her money. So tell us a little bit about that movie and why you love that movie so much.
But she wouldn't have played that part 10 years earlier.
Right.
But she realized at that point, she was 46 or 47,
Yeah.
a dangerous age
Yeah.
for an actress then and now.
Yeah.
Because there's still a double standard.
Totally.
Unfairly.
Totally.
Still a double standard. But she was sensible enough to know it was a great part, a great star vehicle, and she reluctantly but shrewdly agreed to play it. Ironically, it was originally offered to Bette Davis.
Who turned it down?
Turned it down. And Bette Davis played the part in The Star about an alcoholic has-been that had been originally offered to Bette Davis.
Joan Crawford played the part right.
Bette Davis played in The Star, but it was originally offered to Joan Crawford.
Right.
And then, of course, they get together in Who's Afraid of Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, which is terrific.
Oh, absolutely.
And they're both great in it.
They are, yeah. Did you think when they were playing that, Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, do you think they understood fundamentally that they were sending themselves up of who they once were?
I think by that point they were relieved to have great parts,
To have work.
to have work, and they knew it was a good script, and the parts were right for them.
Yeah,
They were professional.
yeah,
They were terrific pros.
yeah, yeah. Now, as their era is ending, but they're still clinging on, there's a whole new crop of leading ladies coming up, and I think the star of your book is the beautiful and wonderful Grace Kelly. And she
Star
really...
of the book?
Well, in many ways. I mean, you know, as you see the older generation fade, Grace Kelly comes up. Tell us about Grace Kelly, where she came from, and as a young man, because this is a memoir in some part, what did you make of Grace Kelly the first time you saw her on the screen?
Well, I saw her at High Noon first.
Yeah.
And I thought she was terrific. But you know, if Grace Kelly had made only one film, Rear Window, we would remember her still.
Yeah.
She's unforgettable in Rear Window. She has such presence on screen.
Yeah.
Such a sense of class and elegance and dignity and humor.
Yeah.
And a kind of an undertone of wickedness.
Yes. And a kind of smoldering sexuality.
Absolutely.
Under the, where was she
Fire
from?
and Ice.
Yeah, the mainline, you know, fancy
Yes.
part of Philadelphia where she came from. But underneath it, you think, man, she's good in bed. You just know it.
And of course, she became a real-life princess, and it was an ideal role for her.
That's right.
Because she could play that part beautifully. Her family were bricklayers from Philadelphia, but she had an elegance about her.
Yeah, yeah.
But it was a very short career.
Well, yes, yes. What was her relationship like with Hitchcock? Because he could be tough on a lot of his leading ladies. Could she stand up to him?
A lot of his leading ladies have told all. She never said a word.
Really?
I think she was very grateful to him. I think they remained personal friends. I think he respected her, and she him. No scandal there. It was Tippi Hedren who was really unhappy with Hitchcock. And
Yes.
has been very vocal about it, and I've interviewed her several times. But Grace Kelly, no.
Give us the
She was
gossip.
grateful to Hitchcock. He gave her her most memorable roles.
Yeah, yeah. Well, give us the gossip on what Tippi Hedren said about Hitchcock.
That's another book for another time.
Just give us a little tidbit. One little juicy bit.
Well, the scene in The Birds in which she's attacked by birds, she was told that all the birds were going to be mechanicals. She wasn't told until the morning of the shoot that some of the birds were real. And so she was really attacked.
Wow. How does Hitchcock navigate the 50s? Because he's doing film noir too, but most of them are in black and white, and he decides to go in color. Why is that?
Hitchcock navigates the 50s almost better than anyone else. The next week at Film Forum, 9 masterworks from Hitchcock in the 1950s. 9 great films from one director in one decade, his greatest decade. And Bruce Goldstein, who programs the Film Forum, said we wanted to put that as a separate week because if we mixed Hitchcock in with the others, he would overshadow everyone.
Right,
Because
right.
his work commands so much attention. They expect to sell out just about at every show. I mean, great films.
Right.
Not only Rear Window and To Catch a Thief and North by Northwest, and Strangers on a Train, and Vertigo, The Wrong Man, which people may not know.
Oh, yeah, it's a good
But
movie.
Hitchcock also made his worst film in the 50s.
Which is?
Does anybody know The Trouble with Harry?
Oh, yes.
Horrifyingly awful.
It's with the dead body, right? That was always all over the place.
So unfunny.
With Leave It to Beaver.
Yes.
Beaver Cleaver's in it.
Yes.
Right,
So unfunny.
right. Why does Hitchcock, when everyone else is doing film noir in black and white, why does he go for color?
Hitchcock was not going to be held by the standards of what other people were doing. He saw Rear Window and Vertigo in color, and he was right to do so. They're still film noir.
Absolutely, no question about it. But the vibrancy of the color is amazing.
But there can be film noir en couleur.
So as we move through the 50s, and then we begin to get in the 60s, who are the young directors who are coming up in the 50s, who are going to change everything in the 60s?
Stanley Kubrick started in the 50s.
Yeah. The Killers, right?
The Killing.
The Killing,
The
right.
Killing.
Yeah.
Paths of Glory.
All right. Right. Right.
Yeah, terrific. And then, of course, he went on to become a master.
Yeah. And what are they seeing in the 50s that they're kind of going to rebel against into the 60s?
Well, I think there's the perception that the 50s were straight-laced, and compared to the 60s, the 50s were more conservative sexually. The first Oscar winner of the 60s is The Apartment.
Yeah.
Remember that?
Great movie.
Which was daring sexually at the time. It now looks very tame, frankly, and sentimental. But at the time, it was more sexually provocative than 60s films had been. Elmer Gantry. There was a shift. The Chapman Report. You could be more sexually open in the 60s compared to the 50s.
Tell us about the Chapman Report for people who don't know what it was.
That's a 60s film, but it's a report about women and sexuality. And for the time, it was very steamy. It really was a steamy film. Now again, it perhaps looks a little naive, but not then.
Right. But what's fascinating, in as you detail in the book, you do see a sense of what you can do in the movie shifting. You can start to get away with a little more. A little more in the sexuality, a little more questioning about what's going on politically, and that is beginning to happen throughout the 50s.
But my contention is that sometimes when you can't say everything
It's better.
correctly, it's better for the artist.
Yeah.
It stimulates creativity. You can be indirect and use allegory and metaphor.
That's right.
If you can say everything, it's a statement.
Right.
If you have to be indirect and with layers, it's more artistic.
Yeah.
So I'm not saying censorship is good. I'm saying it can be creative for the right people.
Well, I think, I mean, All About Eve is perfect in that way because clearly the George Sanders character is a homosexual. But it can never be said whatsoever, but you know it's there. And his sadomasochism comes out for his control. And it's never spoken of openly, but you just feel it throughout the whole movie.
And there are a lot of films in the 50s in that. I'm going to Boston this weekend to host a 50 series, and one of the films is a film I hadn't seen in a while, and I watched it this afternoon, just on this subject you're mentioning. Does anybody remember Calamity Jane? A Doris Day musical western, which is loaded with...
She's a lesbian.
She's a lesbian. She's a lesbian, and Doris Day plays it that way. But you can't say it, so
Right.
it's a queer-coded text. Fascinating. It has all these underlying ripples. If you could just come right out and say it, it wouldn't be as interesting or provocative.
Do you think the studio moguls understood those kind of movies that were being made under their watch?
I think they had a great capacity for looking the other way. It's surprising you. Who's seen The Robe?
Oh.
Do you know the original script of The Robe was written by one of the Hollywood 10? And The Robe equates ancient Christians with communists who meet in cells and who are a danger to the state. And The Robe in the novel by Lloyd C. Douglas is brown. In the movie, The Robe is red.
Ooh, that's interesting. We're going to take some questions in a minute, but I want to wrap up with, because, I've covered Broadway for years, and you make an interesting point that there were quite a few great plays coming out of Broadway, but they didn't make the best movies. For example, I think of Death of a Salesman, one of the great plays, and yet the movie fell flat. Why do you think that was?
The movie's better than its reputation.
Right.
And Kevin McCarthy is fabulous in it. Do the scene when he asks his father, "Let me go." Do you remember that scene?
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
very powerful.
Yeah.
Very powerful. But it was written for the stage.
Yeah.
Its language is theatrical. Its visual depictions are theatrical. Tennessee Williams was on again, off again as a as a source for films. Some of the films are good, some of them aren't.
Terrible. Yeah, some of them are terrible.
Some of them are terrible.
Yeah. Why is it that?
The language is too heightened, or too poetic, or too artful. Movies need a more conversational tone.
Right. I mean, it was, I think, Elia Kazan who solved that problem, though, in Streetcar Named Desire, which is
visual.
Yeah.
Dazzling. The visual dazzlement supports the acting.
Yeah. And the language of Tennessee Williams.
And the language of Tennessee Williams. You can't do Tennessee Williams realistically. It has to be something heightened.
Right. Why? Last question for you. I'm always curious, how come the studios would they'd hire the great playwrights, they'd hire the great novelists, and then they put them through the ringer and basically chuck out their screenplays and hire a bunch of second-rate people to do the movies? Why is that?
I think I can answer that. When I talked to Otto Preminger's widow about movie dialogue, the original screenwriter for Exodus was Leon Uris, who wrote the novel of Exodus. And Otto had to fire him and replaced him with Dalton Trumbo. And Mrs. Preminger said, it's a very short but very telling sentence. Mrs. Preminger said, Dalton Trumbo knew how to make people sound like they're talking to each other. And Uris couldn't do that. So the scenarists, who may not be the artists of the great writers, the great novelists, the great playwrights, they knew how to make it sound like people were talking to each other.
Right.
And you need a more natural flow. And you don't need a writer calling attention to the writing. You don't need a lot of fine writing in movies that can get in the way.
Right. That's right. That's right. Because you can eliminate an entire scene with a close-up of the way somebody looks.
Absolutely. So what Mrs. Preminger said about Dalton Trumbo, he could write dialogue that sounded as if people were talking to each other.
Yeah.
That's what you need in movies.
Fascinating. Take some questions for Foster.
What's your take on Rita Hayworth?
Better than her reputation. And Rita Hayworth was very courageous about allowing herself to grow older on film. She played, when she was no longer Rita Hayworth, she played characters who were aging and who were no longer beauties and who were suffering for feeling left out. A film nobody's seen called Circus World, in which she plays a former beauty. She actually gives a great tragic performance. She's
Circus
very
beauty.
brave.
Yeah.
She's very brave. She no longer wanted to protect her beauty and to be real. She's very good as a waitress in a movie with Glenn Ford called The Money Trap, which opened as a second feature in New York. She's really good in it. And the critic in the Times said she never looked more like an actress and less like a star.
It's a good line.
Yes, it is a good line.
Very good line.
Now.
It's a very good line. Was that Bosley Crothers?
No, I think it was.
Yeah, a very good line.
It's a very good line.
I'm thinking of Shirley Booth coming to Hollywood with Come Back Little Sheba to make the movie. You know, she won awards on Broadway. And the movie she did with Anthony Quinn, Hot Spell.
Very bad movie.
It's his favorite.
I don't know how those were received at the time. Do you have anything to say
Shirley
about Shirley Booth?
Shirley Booth was not a movie star. She simply wasn't. I think to cast Burt Lancaster opposite her in Come Back Little Sheba doesn't make a lot of sense. Of course, she owns that part, but not with Burt Lancaster playing her husband.
Because he's a movie star.
He's a movie star.
Yeah.
And she's not.
Yeah.
And so she had no Hollywood career. She made 4 films at Paramount. Hollywood had no place for her.
What's your evaluation of Marlon Brando?
The greatest actor in the history of movies.
Wow. Well, that was one of my favorite movies back then, On the Waterfront.
That's my favorite. Well, it's the best acted film I've ever seen.
Good.
A number of years ago, I hosted a screening in Hollywood of On the Waterfront, and the guest was Eva Marie Saint, who's still with us at age 99, by the way, and doing beautifully. And I introduced her by saying, and now, please welcome the co-star of the best acted film ever made. And when she got to the stage, she said, "You just made that up."
Sir.
Maybe I did, I said, but I believe it.
I'm fascinated by the blacklisting period, but also, my wife showed me the movie Gentleman's Agreement.
Yeah.
And then you talked about the whole playing down the Judaism.
Well, there's a whole story connected to that film. Gentleman's Agreement was produced by the one Gentile mogul,
Yeah.
Darrell F. Zanuck.
Right.
All of the Jewish moguls went to Mr. Zanuck and said, "Please do not make this movie. We do not want to call attention to anti-Semitism." He made the film and won the Academy Award. But the film, released in 1946, after the war, makes not one mention of the Holocaust.
Yeah.
The biggest problem confronting a Jewish person is you don't get a room at a restricted hotel.
Wow.
Pretty minor compared to what had just happened in Europe. The Jewish moguls did not want to call attention to Jewish subjects.
Was an early Holocaust film The Pawnbroker?
Yes, it was.
Brilliant Rod Steiger in that.
Really, 65,
Yeah,
Sidney Lumet.
right.
But that couldn't have been made earlier.
In the
Couldn't have
1950s.
been made in the 50s, no. Schindler's List couldn't have been made in the 50s.
Diary of Anne Frank, when was that made?
1959, 20th Century Fox, the Gentile studio. The director, George Stevens.
Right.
A Gentile. And I told George Stevens Jr., who's a friend of mine, that his father should be at Yad Vashem in the of Righteous Gentiles.
And written by Goodrich and Hackett. Not Jewish names.
Not Jewish names.
Oh my gosh.
Not Jewish name.
That is amazing. And is it really true when you go to the museum in Hollywood that they've wiped away the moguls, the Jewish moguls, the whole history of the fact that...
They've been forced to include them. There's going to be a small permanent exhibit because Jewish...
How can it be small? They're the people who created the business.
Ask the Academy about that decision.
Can't ask the unions about what's going on with Israel because some of their statements were pretty weak, I would have to say.
Yes.
Yeah. Any more questions?
What about John Garfield?
He died in 1951.
Well, part of the beginning.
But I can tell you a nice little story about John Garfield. In 1951, my mother took me to a matinee of a movie called He Ran All the Way, which was not an appropriate film to take a little kid to. And I didn't realize until years later that my mother took me because, like a lot of women in America, she was in love with John Garfield.
You were talking about movies, plays turning into movies, and how, they don't always work. Doesn't the fact that the stage, play is really about development of character, while movies tend to be the development of plot? And is that one of the reasons why sometimes they can't make the crossover?
I don't think I wouldn't put it in that way, Ken.
I mean, I think great plays have have a strong plot.
Yeah, and great movies have great characters. Sometimes it's language. The language may be too studied, or the situation may be too closed in physically. The setting may be too limited.
One of the problems I find when I always found this with Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, which is a great play, but there was this need, I guess, on Mike Nichols' part, to always have to open things up. And when you open up Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf and they go to the bar and they're to the swing, you lose the claustrophobia of that living room where those two people slug it out night after night. And sometimes I think by opening a play up, you lose the power of the play.
Mostly yes, but don't you think that film works anyway?
It does, except I don't like the fact that she's on the swing set, and I don't like the fact that they go to the bar. Because to me that play is these people live in a cage, and you are in that cage for that night with Nick and Honey.
So you think there's the tension is reduced?
Exactly, yeah, I do. And I think Richard Burton's terrific, but I've never quite bought Elizabeth Taylor in that role. I just haven't.
I think she's good.
She's still too.
You think she's amazing?
Yes.
Yeah, I don't.
You don't quite buy it.
I mean, to me, I have the old record, the LP of Uta Hagen, and Uta Hagen's voice is
Yeah.
just,
Oh, that's a great record.
yeah. Oh, it's terrific. And Arthur Hiller, very good,
Fabulous,
very
yeah.
good. Yes, in the back.
What's your take on Lee Strasberg?
He trained some of the greatest actors in the history of our theater and films. He knew a lot. He was a difficult man
And manipulative, the way he controlled
and
people.
manipulative, but he recognized talent,
Yeah,
and he knew how to shape it and groom it.
yeah.
I mean, he was the guru of West 44th Street, the actor studio. The high priest, the guru.
Yeah.
He was amazing. You have to give him a lot of credit.
I always had a problem, though, with people like Lee Strasberg, and I have a problem with some of these directors and these acting teachers. I rebel against the notion of the guru, that these young people put their lives in the hands of these people who can manipulate them. And there's something that I find unsettling and creepy about that, and I think he was a part of that world.
He could exert undue control over the lives of his students,
Yes.
and that was a potential danger.
Yeah. There is, by the way, I have in my possession the last play that Arthur Miller was working on before he died. And it's a play about the making of the Misfits. And Lee and Anna Strasberg are characters in it. And Marilyn Monroe is not in it. She's in her trailer throughout the whole time. But it's all about the people around her trying to control her. And I went to a reading directed by Robert Falls, and Lee and Anna Strasberg were played brilliantly by Frank Langella and Tova Feldshuh. And they were spectacular, of just these people who were controlling the star. It's a flawed play, it doesn't quite work, but if you want to understand the Misfits, and which is toward the end of your book, it's Arthur Miller's attempt to explain what happened on the set of that movie. And I've been trying and pushing so hard to get Robert Falls and Rebecca Hall, Arthur's daughter, to do the play, but she doesn't feel it's good enough to be put on. But as a curiosity, it's a fascinating play.
Sounds fascinating.
It is, yeah.
Yeah.
Should be done as a reading. Take one more question, and then we'll wrap it up. Well, we'll take two more. Well, three more. Go ahead, yeah.
Do you have any, are there any more showings of those 3D movies?
Yes. Check the schedule at the Film Forum.
Some
50
I've always
from the
wanted to see,
50s.
like Kiss Me Kate, I've always wanted to see.
I think you
that.
might have missed that, but that's great. Have you seen that in 3D?
No, I haven't. I've never seen it in 3D.
You
No.
haven't? You've never seen?
I've seen the movie. I've never seen 3D.
Then
No.
You haven't seen it.
Okay, well.
The Creature from the Black Lagoon is playing again, and It Came from Outer Space. They're both good.
What about the Dial In for Murder? Any more?
Yes, that'll be playing next week, 3 or 4 separate screenings.
Okay.
Be sure to get down to the Film Forum to see Dial M for Murder in 3D.
Yes.
I was just curious, what place does Arthur Freed have with all of the musicals that happened in the 50s?
The highest.
Yeah.
The Arthur Freed unit was #1 at MGM. They produced the greatest musicals in the history of Hollywood. The highest.
And most of that was in the 50s?
He did his best work in the 50s as the unit was being disassembled. And his greatest film, in my opinion, was the last great musical he made, as everything was falling apart. Gigi.
Oh, it's a wonderful, yeah.
Isn't that wonderful?
Yeah.
It doesn't have a good reputation anymore.
But what's interesting, people somehow think it was a Broadway musical first, but it wasn't. It was a movie first.
It was a movie. It was not a Broadway musical, but it opened at a legitimate house, as if it were a Broadway musical. It opened at the then Royale Theater.
Right.
Did you know that?
I did not know. No, I did not know. I think maybe, you know, for younger women, Thank Heaven for Little Girls might be a problematic song, but
Only if you are a humorless,
absolutely.
political, correct tyrant. Would that song be a
This is true. You know, and we should wrap it up so we can all be convivial, but we didn't touch on Walt Disney, but I have to say, and this drives me crazy about political correctness, I remember as a kid going to the drive-in and seeing Song of the South and absolutely being enchanted. And when I was at Columbia here in the 1980s, they re-released Song of the South. And I went to see it at the old, it was the theater on the Upper West Side where... No, it wasn't the Thalia. It was the theater where Woody Allen goes in, I think, Annie Hall to see the Marx Brothers movies. It was
The
like
New Yorker?
the Metro, the Zing.
The Metro?
The Metro, yeah, the Metro. It was on the Upper West Side, right? And I went to see it in the afternoon, Song of the South. And it was the 80s, so we weren't quite as sensitive as we are today. And I just remember being enchanted again. And there was a father with his little girl, and she sat there, and when the movie ended, she said, "Daddy, can we see it again?" And you cannot show that film today.
No, you cannot.
And I think that's a loss.
A huge loss.
We have to accept the movies that were made of their time.
One of my themes in the book, which we haven't really talked about, you have to accept the films as products of their time.
Right.
50 years from now, people will look at films we are releasing and looking at now, and they'll say, what were those people in 2023 thinking of? Believe me, that's coming. 50 years. We'll meet here in 50 years. You have to give the past some leeway.
Exactly.
Don't you?
Yes.
Give them some margin. They didn't know everything. We think we know everything now. We don't.
Absolutely. And you can't wipe away the past. You can't not read books because they might offend you. You can't not watch movies because they might offend you. You can't not watch TV shows because they may not offend you. You can accept that, but you can also appreciate the artistry that those artists at the time brought to those movies.
Absolutely.
And Song of the South is an enchanting, delightful movie.
Yes, it is. But to end on an upbeat note, I wrote the book because I'm a child of the 50s, and in my opinion, I say my humble opinion, but it's not really a humble opinion.
He's the author.
Not really a humble opinion. In my opinion, the 1950s represented the most productive, highest achievement in the history of American filmmaking. We will not see its like again. And I wanted to celebrate this decade, often dismissed in the way that you mentioned at the very beginning of our talk. This bland decade produced more great movies than any other 10-year period in American filmmaking. I think that's worth celebrating.
Thank you, Foster.
Thank you so much, Foster Hirsch.